My name is Jackie Cabasso. I'm the Executive Director of the Western States Legal Foundation in Oakland, California, which is a nonprofit pro-nuclear abolition organization founded in 1982. Since 1982, Western States Legal Foundation has focused on the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, which is one of the nation's 3 nuclear weapons research and design laboratories. And what we have discovered and publicized in recent years is the enormous technology overlap between nuclear weapons research and development experimental programs and the research and development of missile defense systems, components for missile defense systems, and other kinds of exotic and high-tech weapons, including space-based weapons. You have to remember that Lawrence Livermore was the birthplace of Ronald Reagan's original Star Wars program, and they have been quietly working away ever since, although the public forgot about Star Wars for a number of years. The original Star Wars, which was the sort of popular nickname given to Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, first appeared in a speech that Ronald Reagan gave in 1983, in which he called on America's scientists to turn their talents to developing technologies that would protect the United States and make the need for nuclear weapons obsolete. And some of his advisors actually thought that he'd gotten the idea from a science fiction movie that he had seen, but in retrospect, it looks like it was a really brilliant ploy to kind of steal the thunder of the anti-nuclear movement, which was huge at that time, and to put out this vision of a shield, a space-based shield that would protect the United States from all incoming missiles. Now, it turned out that the system that Reagan was proposing also included elements of ground-based interceptors. That's what we call now the National Missile Defense System, possibly boost phase interceptors, which would be based on ships or in other parts of the world. That's what we call theater missile defense now. The idea, the vision of Reagan's Star Wars was to provide an impenetrable shield which would protect the United States from any and all incoming weapons, chemical, biological, nuclear, whatever. And so his system had a lot of different components: space-based, exotic weapons, ground-based interceptors, ship-based interceptors, things that now form components of what we are again starting to call Star Wars. But it can really be broken into a number of different elements. We have been hearing a lot about national missile defense over the last few years because under the Clinton administration, actually in 1999, Clinton finally caved in and signed legislation making it the policy of the United States to deploy a limited national missile defense system as soon as it's technologically feasible. The Clinton limited national missile defense system was to consist initially of 20 interceptors deployed in Alaska, plus upgrades to a number of existing radars and some new radar systems. And then there were a series of add-ons, including ongoing, although little talked about, research and development of space-based weaponry, a space-based laser, surface ship-based theater missile defenses to be deployed in cooperation potentially with Japan and Taiwan, and so on. There are no plans to deploy nuclear weapons in space or to use nuclear weapons offensively as part of the Star Wars system. However, there is research underway now into the potential development of a nuclear-tipped interceptor for a ground-based missile, and that research is planned at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in the National Ignition Facility, the giant laser which is being built to replace underground nuclear testing, and which is to be a principal nuclear weapons research tool. So there's one example of the kind of technology overlap that I was talking about. Now, why would the United States consider putting a nuclear-tipped interceptor on a defensive missile? It's because a hit-to-kill, bullet hitting a bullet type of missile defense, which is what is currently being developed and tested, would not be effective against an incoming missile carrying biological or chemical weapons, which, in order to be effective, would have to be dispersed in many thousands of little droplets or submunitions. And there's no way that one of these ballistic missile interceptors could intercept all of those dispersed submunitions. And that's why they're talking about the development of a nuclear-tipped interceptor. Also, because so far the hit-to-kill, bullet-hitting-a-bullet interceptor experiments have largely failed, and it has not been demonstrated that the system, as currently designed, will be able to achieve its objective. And I say achieve its objective rather than work, because one thing that it's important for people to understand is that each and every research and development line involved in this kind of a program doesn't have to work as designed in order to lead to scientific discoveries and technological developments that can be reapplied to other kinds of weaponry. National missile defense, as it has been conceived of and promoted during the years of the Clinton administration, starting with the 1994 Republican Contract with America, where it first reemerged, is initially intended to be a system designed to protect the United States from relatively small numbers of incoming missiles carrying nuclear warheads primarily, or possibly chemical or biological warheads. Initially, there would be 20 interceptors built in Alaska, and there would be existing radars upgraded, additional radars built, and potentially add-ons later to add more interceptors and to add other elements to the system, which could eventually go into space, which could include theater missile defenses, which would be regionally based missile defenses based on surface ships or on the territory of other countries who allowed it to be there. China, like Russia for other reasons, is extremely upset about the potential for the U.S. to develop and deploy a national missile defense system, and has made it very clear that if the U.S. goes ahead, it will feel the need to increase and build up its own nuclear arsenal and its own missile capability in order to protect itself from the United States. In other words, in order to protect itself from the United States' capability of striking first and then being able to hit incoming Chinese missiles. That's the whole insane logic behind this system. Now, in the case of Russia, there is another problem, because the United States and Russia, actually the United States and the Soviet Union, in 1972 entered into a treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which very specifically limits the numbers of national missile defense sites that each country can have. Originally, it was 2 sites per country, the national capital and 1 missile site. A later protocol amended it to only 1 missile site for each country. Interestingly, Russia selected Moscow to protect its people, and the United States selected its missile base in North Dakota. So that I think that's a very interesting little historical footnote. Now, I want to say something about the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, because it's fundamentally important here in that Russia has, which is the successor state now to the Soviet Union, has been quite clear that it will not accept amendments to the ABM treaty and that it is not willing to abrogate the ABM treaty, and that if the United States goes ahead and deploys a national missile defense system, that Russia will consider the U.S. to have abrogated the treaty, and Russia has said all bets are off. It will withdraw from all existing arms control treaties. Now, the rationale behind the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty is a very bad rationale because it's based on the enshrining of mutually assured destruction. It was designed to make sure that neither country had an advantage in terms of its defensive capabilities. In other words, neither side would have an incentive to build up its offensive capabilities in order to overcome the other country's defensive capabilities. Now, while it's very important right now to keep the U.S. in the ABM treaty in order to not provoke Russia into a new arms race, the ABM treaty is fundamentally flawed because it perpetuates the system of mutually assured destruction. And so in the long term, I think that the ABM treaty and many of the other arms control treaties will have to be replaced by a much more comprehensive disarmament instrument. But in any case, the problem right now, politically, is that if the U.S. deploys a national missile defense system and any of these other elements, it very likely will ignite new arms races with China and with Russia, and those in turn will have very severe and serious regional implications in Asia, where the U.S. is negotiating for theater missile defenses with Japan and with Taiwan, which will be even more provocative to China, and which in turn will affect the security perceptions of India and Pakistan, who have begun to weaponize their nuclear weapons program. So it's actually very difficult to conceive of a more dangerous and destabilizing program in terms of global security than national missile defense and Star Wars. There are a lot of technical problems with national missile defense, and they've gotten a lot of attention. 2 of the 3 interceptor tests to date have failed. In other words, the interceptor has failed to hit the target. So that's an indication that it isn't working too well as conceived. Now, first of all, missiles are not the only or even most likely way for a nuclear, chemical, or biological weapon to be delivered to the United States if someone was really intent on doing so. There are lots of other ways to get them on ships, smuggled in through various means, and so on. So that's the first sort of technical criticism. The second is that in order to be effective, biological or chemical weapons need to be delivered in such a way that they spread out in lots of little droplets or packages or what they call submunitions. And there's no way that one interceptor can hit thousands of dispersed droplets of a chemical or biological agent. And then the third criticism, which has actually received the most attention, is that anyone who is attempting to deliver a warhead on a ballistic missile to the United States is also going to send a whole bunch of decoys. And there's no way for the interceptor to distinguish between the decoys and the real warhead. And actually, there's a well-known critic of this national missile defense at Harvard named Ted Postal, who has done some research and claims that the the test that has succeeded actually was faked, that the interceptor was guided to the actual mock warhead as opposed to the decoys. So those are kind of the three main technical criticisms of that particular program. However, I think it's dangerous to rely too heavily on the technical criticisms, because if you do, then you create an environment in which it's very likely that the program is going to get more funding, even more funding, in order to fix the technical flaws, and that in turn will drive the research and development in directions that may produce other kinds of weapon systems that will work. So I always am careful to not rely too heavily on the technical criticisms, because I think that the dangers of igniting new arms races with Russia and China are far more pressing. Most Americans are simply unaware that the United States continues to premise its national security policy on the threatened first use of nuclear weapons, and that the United States continues to maintain thousands of nuclear weapons on hair-trigger alert, weapons that are deployed on Trident submarines that are cruising the world's oceans at the same rate as at the height of the Cold War, and land-based weapons that are within 2 minutes of launch on warning. Now, while most Americans have no idea that we are living on a nuclear hair trigger, every country in the world is well aware of that policy and that reality, and they know that the implicit threatened use of nuclear weapons backs up any U.S. military action or U.S.-led military action anywhere in the world. Kosovo, for example. Russia was well aware of the fact that there are U.S. nuclear weapons deployed in 10 NATO countries. And Russia, after being rebuffed in its efforts to be a peacemaking force in Kosovo, announced that it was going to modernize and redeploy its own tactical or short-range nuclear weapons as a defensive posture. So that's one real-world application that we've seen. Most Americans are completely unaware of the fact that the U.S. has actually threatened the use of nuclear weapons 4 times over the past decade: North Korea, Libya, and Iraq. So while the United States continues to premise its national security on the threatened first use of nuclear weapons, and continues to brandish those nuclear weapons rather visibly, it's not realistic to think that other countries are not going to adopt the same kinds of national security policies. And we see that starting to happen to some extent in South Asia, where India and Pakistan are using the same rationale to defend their nuclear tests and the possible weaponization of their nuclear weapons. So that's the first thing that people need to understand. Why we should be concerned is that we are continuing to drive a kind of ongoing low-level, if you will, nuclear arms race. The deployment of national missile defenses, theater missile defenses, space-based weapons, the implications for U.S. treaty obligations, not only the anti-ballistic missile treaty, but the treaty preventing an arms race in outer space. And you have a recipe for an out-of-control international arms race that is going to be more dangerous and destabilizing than anything we've seen before. And we have the United States engaging in behavior and spouting rhetoric about the need to protect U.S. interests and investments from space and so on, that is just like inciting a nest of bees to go after, to sting someone, you know? I mean, it's a really dangerous situation, and people have to wake up and deal with it. Americans have to wake up and deal with it. We are really endangering our national security in an unprecedented way. We already know that about $60 billion or more has been spent on this limited ballistic missile defense system that so far isn't working. And so that tells us that a lot more money is likely going to be spent to try to make it work. And in that sense, the arguments, the criticisms being made about its failure to work so far are going to tend to increase the amount of money that's being expended rather than decrease it. Every weapons system that I know about historically has ended up costing a lot more than they originally projected. So I think it's a given that if it goes forward, even more money will be spent. The money is coming from our pockets, first of all. As I think everybody recognizes over the last period, including the Clinton administration, funding for all kinds of social services has been reduced and reduced and reduced in the name of balancing the budget, which is a highly questionable justification, I think, for many reasons. And military spending has continued to go up, although perhaps not as a percentage of the total budget. We're spending over $310 billion a year on the military. And what for? It's more than the combined military budgets of something like the next 14 countries in the world. It's so disproportionate that it's actually hard to take in. Now, at the same time, although many people have been benefiting from a robust economy, we who have our eyes open can see larger numbers of people living on the street and can see all kinds of impoverished public education programs, poor health care programs, lack of health care availability to lots of Americans. And so basically, I think in a very common sense sort of way that the money is coming out of what should be spent on ensuring the basic necessities for people in this country and around the world. We are being told now more than ever that we need to dominate the globe in the name of national security. And global domination is to be carried out through military superiority. But I believe that that is the wrong definition of security. And I refer to the United Nations Development Program, which has done a lot of really good work in redefining security. They talk about security in human and ecological terms. The security of an individual in her home, in her family, in her village, in her job, in her environment. That's security. And that kind of security has a completely different set of requirements than the kind of national security through global domination that our political leaders are shoving down our throats. And I think that that's the best way to think about how national resources should be prioritized. There are a number of other countries that have nuclear weapons. That includes Russia, China, the United Kingdom, France, India, Pakistan, and Israel, in addition to the United States. Those are the only countries known to have nuclear weapons. A number of those countries and others have missile technology, and some of them have advanced missile technology. Among those, Russia and China, which would be considered to be countries of concern to the United States right now, largely through its own provocative actions. The CIA estimated a couple of years ago that under realistic conditions, it would be at least 15 years before any country presented any kind of a serious missile threat to the United States. Now, in 1998, the Rumsfeld Commission, which was headed by Donald Rumsfeld, the designee for Secretary of Defense, changed the CIA's method of assessment from a realistic to a worst-case scenario, and concluded that if a country like North Korea got significant technical assistance from a country like China, then it might be able to develop a missile that could hit the United States within 5 years. And that actually turned out to be the best selling point to the Congress for the National Missile Defense System, which Clinton signed into legislation in 1999. So, sure, there are technological capabilities all over the world. Are they being developed aggressively to be used against the United States? I don't think so, but I think they will be if the United States continues to engage in such provocative behavior. It's not in Russia's interest to spend its limited resources on developing its military, but that's what they will do if they feel they're threatened by the United States. It's not in China's interest, but most of all, it's not in our interest to spend our resources developing these methods and means of global military domination. Lots of countries have all kinds of advanced technological capabilities that could be turned in the direction of developing weapons to attack the United States or defend itself from a perceived threat by the United States. I don't think that that's the way those technologies are being used now, but I do think that that's the way they will be used in the future if the United States continues to be hell-bent on this global domination through any means. Russia, for example, certainly has better things to spend its money on than developing new nuclear weapons and new missile delivery systems. But that's what it will do if it feels threatened by the United States. China has certainly much better things to spend its resources on than weapons. India and Pakistan, my God, the poverty there is unbelievable. They should not be spending their money trying to emulate the national security model put forward by the United States. And we shouldn't be doing that here either. There are 4 defense contractors: Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, and TRW, who have split the lion's share of Pentagon contracts over the last couple of years for ballistic missile defense programs. Those 4 companies gave over $2 million in campaign contributions in the last 2 years to 25 pro-national missile defense senators who last April sent a letter to President Clinton demanding that he not make any deals with Russia regarding the ABM treaty and the deployment of missile defenses. So it's quite clear that these 4 companies in particular have enormously influential lobbying operations underway, and so it's not surprising that they also are getting the lion's share of the contracts. Now, interestingly, Lockheed Martin was fined $13 million last year for selling sensitive satellite technology to China in violation of arms export control laws. Martin Marietta in 1994 had done something similar. So it's worth noting that some of these corporations seem to be kind of hedging their bets by making sure that there is a supply of enemy countries that we need to have them develop defenses against while they're supplying the technology to those future enemies so that they can indicate a credible threat. I mean, it's a disgusting system, really. I think that we can expect very strong negative reactions from countries all over the world, including Russia and China in particular, but also including our European allies, who are already starting to express considerable alarm at the idea that the United States appears to be so willing to deploy a system that threatens to unravel the entire existing arms control regime. The Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty is essentially a deal between the 5 official nuclear weapon states, the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK, and the non-nuclear weapon states, the rest of the world. And the deal is that the rest of the world agrees not to acquire nuclear weapons if the 5 nuclear weapon states agree to get rid of theirs. And it should have happened by now. It is the most universal treaty in the world. And as a matter of international law, it is the highest law of the land in the United States under the U.S. Constitution. The provision of the Nonproliferation Treaty that requires the elimination of nuclear weapons was authoritatively interpreted by the International Court of Justice in 1996, which is the judicial arm of the United Nations and which is the highest authority in the world on questions of international law, which said there exists an obligation on the part of all states to conclude negotiations on the elimination of nuclear weapons. Now, if the United States continues to go ahead with its nuclear weapons research, development, testing, and production plans, that's under a program which is very misleadingly called stockpile stewardship. If the United States insists on going forward with the deployment of national and theater missile defenses, which abrogate the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, if the United States continues to go forward with the development of space-based lasers and other space-based weapons, which may violate the treaty preventing an arms race in outer space, then the United States is putting itself in the position of an international outlaw, a rogue state, if you will, and creating a situation in which the rule of law is going to be subsumed or overtaken by some kind of system of international anarchy, and I use the word in the sense of a free-for-all in which there are no restraints on anybody in terms of their own behavior with respect to other states and with respect to their own populations. So that's where all of this could lead on the negative side, and it could lead to actual wars and unprecedented violence. Now, on the positive side, at least it's clear now what we're up against. And I think that during the Clinton administration, a lot of people were confused because they wanted to believe that the Clinton administration was made up of our friends who wanted the same things that we wanted. And there isn't really a lot of evidence to suggest that. The Clinton administration was very bad on nuclear weapons issues. It was very bad on foreign policy. But people didn't seem to be fully convinced of that. Well, now we know. So I think that there's an opportunity for people who care about peace and real security to get their act together. And there's also an opportunity for the other countries of the world to come together and say in a clear voice that we do not accept the domination of the world by one country. The world is made up of many countries, and we all want to be partners. And I don't know how it's going to come out. It's a scary time. Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is on the central coast of California, is a key facility in the missile defense program because it's the site where the mock warheads are launched to be, hopefully, from their point of view, hit by interceptors launched from Kwajalein Atoll in the Pacific. And so it is a visible manifestation of what we're calling now, again, the Star Wars program. And I think it's important for people to understand that these programs with these names like National Missile Defense or Star Wars are not just abstractions. They have actual experimental components. They have actual hardware. They involve real people. And it is important for us to go to those facilities, to draw attention to them, to bring them into the public awareness, to bear witness to what's going on there, and to challenge what's going on there. And I think if we look back over the, recent last 20-year history of the anti-nuclear movement, for example, we can see that it was extremely important for hundreds and then for thousands of people to demonstrate at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Before 1982, I think most people in the Bay Area even had no idea there was a nuclear weapons laboratory out there. They thought there was some kind of a university research facility, but they had no idea of what the importance of that facility was. And Vandenberg is like that in a way, because Vandenberg is the visible tip of the iceberg. Now, on a personal level, I was there in July, where I witnessed the launch of the most recent interceptor test. And it was a very powerful and frightening experience, because I saw the mock warhead being launched. It went up into the sky, and it appeared to hang there like a bright white light, pinpoint of light that had 4 points that gradually spread out and filled the whole sky with a weird blue cloud around it. And it just hung there. And I said to my companions, I said, "Oh my God, this is what the beginning of a nuclear war would look like." Because that's what it is. That's what it is. We were watching the launch of the mock nuclear warhead. So on the very personal level, I think it's important and valuable and worthwhile to bear witness. On the political level, I think at this point in our history, it's important for us to regroup on a local and a regional level, to not be focusing all of our attention on the warheads in Washington, D.C., who are less receptive than ever, and to try to build some kind of a locally based, regionally based movement. Now, Vandenberg is not the only place where people should be focusing their attention. Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory is deeply involved in the ballistic missile defense program under a contract with the Department of Energy. And the corporations who are benefiting from the Star Wars program also provide obvious locations where people, I think, should be demonstrating in order to raise the level of their visibility and to try to spark some kind of a real national public debate on this program, which is so dangerous and which has such enormous implications for everybody on the planet. The October 2000 demonstration at Vandenberg was a really interesting experience and actually somewhat unique in my long history of participating in nonviolent direct actions at various facilities. There were about 200 people gathered for a peaceful rally, a model nonviolent rally. Nonviolence guidelines, in fact, were emphasized on several occasions. And there were a few people initially who were willing to risk arrest in an attempt to deliver a letter to the base commander. During the demonstration, a giant black gunboat helicopter was flown from the base and hovered closely overhead, right over the stage, drowning out the speakers, which was a tactic I have never seen before and which was so blatantly an attempt to interfere with our First Amendment rights to freedom of expression that it was actually chilling in and of itself. Before the letter was to be delivered, the road into the base across the street was filled with camouflage-clad troops with batons and dogs. And as we walked across the street to stand in solidarity with the few people who were planning to deliver the letter, a water cannon was brought in, and the individuals who were attempting to deliver the letter were treated very roughly by the troops, which inspired a number of other people to cross the line in solidarity with those few. I ended up being one of those people, although I had not initially planned to be, because I felt that it was extremely important to stand up and be counted and to say, you cannot do that in my name with my complicity. I think that the willingness to risk arrest indicates a level of moral commitment that it's difficult to demonstrate in other ways. And I think that if a person risks arrest, then they should be willing to accept the consequences of their action, because that is part of the moral commitment that they've undertaken. And so in this case, we have been charged with a federal trespass, and we are moving in the direction of having a trial, which frankly I welcome, because it provides an opportunity to have a hearing in a public forum where we can attempt to explain why it is we felt compelled to be at Vandenberg Air Force Base that day, and where we can also attempt to put on evidence to show that the United States is engaged in illegal activity under binding international law by going forward with the development of its Star Wars program. And it is in that sense that I truly believe that I am not guilty of committing a crime. I did not go there to break the law. I went there to uphold the law. And so if we go to trial, we will have an uphill struggle trying to get that kind of evidence in, but we have all kinds of evidence and eminently qualified experts who can testify as to the illegality of this U.S. undertaking under international law. So for me, there's no question I am not guilty, and I welcome the opportunity to make my case in a public courtroom. I think we are at one of those moments of great opportunity and great danger. We know what we're up against. There's no ambiguity about that. And so we have the opportunity to organize a powerful citizens movement. And we have a lot of support around the world, both from governments and from from civil society, other non-governmental organizations. In the last 5 years, the Abolition 2000 Global Network to Eliminate Nuclear Weapons has grown to include more than 2,000 organizations in over 90 countries, making it one of the largest grassroots networks in the world. We have most of the world's countries on record now in the Non-Proliferation Treaty and in the United Nations General Assembly, calling for the elimination of nuclear weapons quickly and also explicitly opposing the deployment of U.S. missile defense systems. So we have a lot going for us. However, we have to be realistic and realize that what we are up against is an extremely powerful, extremely entrenched bureaucracy backed up with unlimited corporate resources, and we should not fool ourselves. What we are talking about, the potential deployment of national missile defense and Star Wars is part of a bigger system that is designed to, as the U.S. Space Command says, protect U.S. interests and investments all over the world, through and from space. And it's unlikely that we are going to be able to stop Star Wars unless we address a larger set of issues and national priorities, and ultimately unless we address the fundamental definition of what does security mean. I would like to posit a realistic alternative to Star Wars, and that is the abolition of nuclear weapons. Because if there were no nuclear weapons, there would be no justification for Star Wars. And I want to stress the point that these two things are intimately connected, and we should address them as two parts of one greater evil.